Hello everyone, I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One-on-One. Johnson Britt was the new district attorney in his hometown of Lumberton, North Carolina, and he immediately had to immerse himself into what would become the biggest case of his career. Johnson Britt had to prosecute Daniel Green and Larry Demery, the two men charged with killing Michael Jordan's father 25 years ago this year. James Jordan had been in Wilmington on that July day in 1993. He was traveling back to Charlotte. He pulled over along the side of Highway 74 near Lumberton to get some sleep. That's where Daniel Green and Larry Demery came upon the car and shot and killed James Jordan, and later they dumped his body in a swamp in South Carolina. In the first part of this intense interview, Johnson Britt takes us through the story of James Jordan's murder. He takes us through how they gathered evidence against Green and Demery, and a meeting he had with Michael Jordan before the trial began. Where was the James Jordan case? How far had it proceeded when you took office?
It really hadn't proceeded very far, and that was one of the reasons that Judge Weeks was appointed basically as a special judge to handle this case from beginning to end. The Chief Justice, North Carolina Supreme Court, declared it an exceptional case, first time that had ever happened in a criminal trial. And there was concern because this occurred in July of 93. Mm-hmm. They were arrested in August of 93. There was a lot of media coverage, not only about the arrest, but in the aftermath, that there really wasn't a case and that these two young men were being framed. And so I believe there was a real belief that they were being seen as scapegoats for an investigation that no one really knew anything about. And so my first involvement in the case was there was a hearing shortly after Judge Weeks was appointed in the fall of 1994, and it was more of a status type check on the case.
Okay.
Or the case is, because there are two defendants. And my predecessor at that hearing said that he intended to bring one of those cases to trial before he left office. And Judge Weeks, you got the impression, was like, you need to slow down. We're not anywhere near trial stage. Mm-hmm. What motions have been filed? What motions have been heard? None.
Yeah.
And so that was in, I want to say September. I mean, they were arrested and indicted almost immediately. And I was approached by some of the SBI investigators in the case. They knew that it wasn't going to go to trial between September and January. And so they were like, we need to find out a way to get you involved, because I was an assistant DA in another county. Right. They were not authorized to turn the information over to me. The only person that could do that was the man that I just defeated in an election, and there was some history there. And so they went and talked with him. I then went and talked with him. And he's like, well, who do you want me to assign the case to within the office? I was like, I don't want you to assign anyone the case. I want you to turn over a copy of the file to me. Let me see what this is about. Let me develop my own theories about the case. And so eventually that was done. Mm-hmm. And I got the file shortly before he resigned. And then literally in December of 94, we started hearing motions. And I'm still learning about this case, and I'm learning about it by preparing to go to court.
Right.
And so
I take it that's not
normal. That's not normal. It was stressful enough.
Right.
I mean, if you think back 25 years ago,
yeah,
O.J. Simpson had just occurred. Mm-hmm. And that was the big trial. Court TV was a big thing. They were covering cases, never really been done like that before. And suddenly you have the celebrity murder of Michael Jordan's dad, and everybody was looking at it. Oh, this is the next big case. And they requested to come in and cover the case. And Judge Weeks, I think, very wisely decided cameras weren't going to be there. We saw in motions hearings that lawyers were playing to the cameras as opposed to addressing him. They would literally turn and look at the camera that was there, and he's like, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm over here."
Really?
So he ended up ruling he wasn't going to let cameras in. He would let them in for the pretrial matters, but for the trial, they would not be in.
Mm-hmm.
So we started progressing, and we had motions to suppress. Both young men had made statements. Their lawyers didn't want those statements in front of the jury. And so we had literally back-to-back, I was involved in back-to-back motion to suppress hearings that had different issues. Daniel Green had not been advised of his Miranda rights. It was a situation where he was not deemed to be in custody, so they didn't decided not to advise him of his Miranda rights. He was free to leave whenever he wanted to. And so he was talking. Down the hall, Larry Demery had actually been taken into custody, so he had been advised of his rights. So the issues were, did Larry Demery knowingly waive his rights and agree to talk with the investigators? And in Daniel Green's case, should Daniel Green have been advised of his rights so he could make the election whether to knowingly talk or not? And the judge ruled in the Green case that he wasn't in custody, it wasn't necessary to Mirandize him, and in the Demery case he ruled that he had properly waived his rights. And so both of the statements were coming into evidence. Larry Demery's statement was much more damning than Daniel Green's. Daniel Green gave a number of versions about how they
what
came.
Had happened.
Yes,
yeah.
And to the point, if you remember John Lovitz from Saturday
Sure,
Night Live,
yeah.
and his character,
Yes.
I always called him the biggest liar.
Yeah.
You know, he start off, he tells a
That's it.
story.
Yeah.
You don't believe us? Well, how about this?
Yeah.
And that was kind of Daniel Green.
Right.
Eventually, I lost count of how many different ways he described how they came to be in possession of the car. He always blamed Larry Demery. Demery initially was denying any involvement.
Mm-hmm.
And then as they shared information with Demery, Demery ended up telling his version of what happened.
As you saw the evidence and as you're starting to learn it, did you have an idea that you thought one would turn on the other? Because in essence, isn't that what happened? Demery.
That's what ended up happening, and it was after the motions to suppress. Where both of the motions had been denied. We were still not in a position where we were headed to trial. We had some other issues to deal with, other motions. They never filed a motion to change venue. Of course, I don't know where you would have changed venue in North Carolina in this case.
Right. That's
So it became an issue of, okay, this is what we know based upon the physical evidence and the other evidence that's been put together. Put their statements aside.
okay.
Who does the evidence point to as being the more culpable? Who does the evidence point to as being the shooter?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that played a significant role in this case was were the cellular phone telephone records. This is the first case, to my knowledge, where cellular phone records had ever been used in a case in North Carolina where literally you track the movement of what was going on based on where the calls were being made.
Had the investigators already done that, or did they already had that?
What people don't understand is Mr. Jordan had been here in Wilmington. He had driven from Charlotte down that day to a funeral.
Mm-hmm.
After the funeral, he went to the home of his friend who had died. There was a dinner, and Mr. Jordan was driving back to Charlotte because he was supposed to be in Chicago the next day for a charity golf tournament that Michael was sponsoring. And so he was driving back to Charlotte to catch a plane the next morning, fly to Chicago to be at this golf tournament. And Michael had a driver, a young man that he met when he first signed with the Bulls. His luck was Michael Jordan shows up in Chicago The Bulls weren't there to greet him. This guy drives a limo. He can tell Michael Jordan's out of his element.
Right.
And he says, "Hey, where are you going?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to wherever the Bulls headquarters is located in this hotel." And he knew who Michael was. And he said, "Well, I'll give you a ride." And so he drove him down there, and from that they developed this relationship where Michael eventually hires him.
Right.
And he becomes a driver for Michael for members of the family in Chicago. So he is there to meet Mr. Jordan the next day at the airport, and he doesn't show.
Okay.
He calls, tells him he hadn't shown. There's not a lot of concern because Mr. Jordan was known to not show up when he was supposed to be there. He was also known to change his plans on a whim. He carried what I'll describe as simply an open airline ticket in his pocket.
Gotcha.
So if he was in Charlotte and was supposed to fly to Chicago, he could pull out a ticket and say, "No, I want to go to Los Angeles." It wasn't unusual.
Yeah. Okay.
And so they went on with the tournament. Still hadn't heard from him. And it was actually Michael's security team that started the investigation. They were trying to determine where Mr. Jordan was. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't get in touch with him. So they were dispatched. They came to North Carolina. And eventually the car was found outside of Fayetteville in Cumberland County. It had been stripped. They contacted, actually a highway patrolman had contacted the dealership in Chicago trying to run down the owner of the car, who was Michael Jordan. The dealership notified the Jordan people, and they came down, met with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department. It was in the middle of a wooded area that is now a residential section, but it was nothing out there. It was east of Fayetteville. The car had been towed to a little garage in Stedman, North Carolina. They checked it out. There was no sign of anything of Mr. Jordan's remaining in the car.
They took the license. I mean, they literally took everything out of it.
They took the license plate. They took the wheels. They took the tires. Mr. Jordan had a set of golf clubs that were in the trunk of the car. They were not there. Papers that would have identified, but everything was gone. And so at that point Cumberland County Sheriff's Department gets involved, and they run down the individuals who actually stripped the car. And they're like, "Where's the man that owns this car? We don't know anything about a man that owns a car. We just know there was a black guy named Daniel, some Indian kid, we don't even know his name, came up here with this car trying to sell it." And we agreed to sell it, and they left. They went back to Lumberton, and they left the car. We decided we'd strip it. That's what we did. And so they get arrested on possession of stolen goods. And it's at that point Daniel Green's name is introduced into this.
Gotcha.
So then they start looking at cell records. All right, Daniel Green, where does he live? Who's this other kid? And when they identified Daniel Green, he lived right outside of Lumberton. Larry Demery lived between Lumberton and Pembroke. But the cell records became important because they started tracking who made this call, who was called, who called you. And the overwhelming majority of the phone calls were made by Daniel Green, which was the first indication that Daniel Green was the one in control. Then as they found out who Daniel Green was, they discovered he had a brother who was in the U.S. Army station at Fort Bragg, and he lived off base. So they go to Fort Bragg looking for him. They go to the CID office. They said, "We need to see this gentleman. We believe he may have some information in what may be a potential homicide." Because at that point, they hadn't made the connection with the body in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And so they locate Daniel Green. Daniel Green's brother is brought to them. They talk to him. He was at a position in the Army. He was either there for his career or he was getting out. And so he said, "Well, my brother came up here driving a fancy red sports car. Never seen one like it before. He's got his friend Larry Demery with him, and they came to my house. And where do you live?" And he takes them to where he lives. And in the area surrounding his house, they discover and find all of this memorabilia items that take them to Mr. Jordan. The golf clubs are there. Mm-hmm. Michael Jordan's name is written on the side of the bag. There are other records that they collect, and Daniel Green's brother ends up telling them, "Look, I told them to get rid of that stuff, get it away from me. They were going to put me in jeopardy, and they went and dumped it out here in the woods." Okay. That's all I know.
So the brother had some inclination that something bad had happened?
He had an inclination. His brother, Daniel Green, was wearing a watch, a gold watch that Michael, eventually we learned, had commissioned to be made for his special friends commemorating the second NBA championship that they won. He also had a ring that Michael had commissioned to commemorate the first NBA championship ring that he was wearing, mm-hmm. that had a Bulls emblem on it, had diamonds in it, and then he had an NBA All-Star ring on that Michael we learned had given to his dad when he had gotten injured, I think his second year in the NBA, and didn't play in the All-Star game, but was voted to it, but because he didn't play, he didn't want the ring.
Right.
And so, again, you're looking, from what I'm doing, I'm looking at, all right, he's making the majority of the phone calls. He's the one that is in control of the car when they go there. Mm-hmm. And then he's the one with what I refer to as the spoils.
Right.
And so they end up not only following, they go interview everybody that they can identify through the phone calls and lock down. This is who I talked to. And in some of them, it was a situation, not only do they call them, they might pull up in front of somebody's house and call them and say, "Hey, I'm just out front." And that happened in Laurinburg, North Carolina. It also happened in a little town in South Carolina with some girls. And so that made it even stronger in terms of, let's build this circumstantial evidence case that we have, because at each of those locations, it was Daniel Green who was showing off.
And he also showed off, if I'm not mistaken, in a video that he made, right?
Video was taken when they went to Fayetteville to get rid of the car. There was a robbery that had occurred, been reported but had not been solved, in the parking lot of a hotel in Roland, North Carolina. And Roland is situated right on the North Carolina-South Carolina line.
Right.
Two elderly couples traveling to Florida. Stayed there overnight, got up early the next morning, going to beat the traffic, going to beat the heat, and get on down to Florida, and they're robbed in the parking lot. One of the things that's taken is an old VHS camera. And so the Roland Police Department, the Sheriff's Department know about that robbery. They don't have suspects because these people can simply say there was a young black man and a young Indian man or young Hispanic man. They weren't sure what race Larry Demery was. And so while they're in Fayetteville, they're right near Fayetteville State University. And so they're over on the campus at Fayetteville State University, and they're in, I guess, what used to be the old gymnasium, and it's being renovated, and a videotape is made. Larry Demery is taking the video. Daniel Green is the subject of the video, and he's singing a rap song. That videotape was not allowed into evidence, but in it he sings about robbing people. He sings about shooting people. And from that video, we were able to take stills of Daniel Green wearing the watch, wearing
right.
the various rings, and ironically, he's wearing a Chicago Bulls hat.
I remember seeing that as we were in the coverage of the trial. Once you got down the line and Demery decided to comply and then said he was going to testify against Green, was that the big point in the investigation that you thought you were going to be able to get both of them convicted?
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was going to get both of them convicted regardless. Okay. I had Demery's statement. Mm-hmm. Demery's statement was a confession to felony murder. I had Daniel Green with everything associated with the robbery. And so there was, not only was when they were arrested on the Jordan case, when Mr. Jordan's body had been discovered in South Carolina, and there was the connection made that this unidentified black man who'd been found in in
a swampy
Marlboro
area.
County, South Carolina,
Swampy area
below Laurinburg.
Yeah.
Body been taken to Newberry, South Carolina for an autopsy. And so when they inquired, the medical examiner in Newberry said, yes, I did an autopsy on a gentleman. I saved his clothes. I cut off his hands, and I removed his jaws for purposes of possibly identifying him. And so the Cumberland County folks, Michael Jordan security people, they go to South Carolina. The clothes actually had been placed in a paper bag, but because they smelled so bad between being in the water, the blood, he had buried them. He dug them up. There was a photograph taken of Mr. Jordan the day he was in Wilmington for that funeral.
Mm-hmm.
The clothes that the individual was wearing were the same clothes that Mr. Jordan had.
Okay.
So then they took possession of the hands. They took possession of the teeth. Person that had died had extensive dental work, and so they took the hands to the. Eventually, they were examined at the state lab in Raleigh, where the fingerprints were rolled and compared with those that were in the system. Mr. Jordan had been arrested in New York as a young man. He had been arrested here shortly, I guess, after Michael started playing professional basketball, or maybe while he was at Carolina. And so he was both in the SBI system and in the FBI system. So they made a positive identification on the fingerprints. Mm-hmm. The dentist who had done the work for Mr. Jordan, they contacted him in Charlotte. He was the dentist for the Panthers. He was the dentist for the Hornets when they were originally there. They go meet with him. He pulls his records. He does. He said,
that's him.
This is him. So you have two of the three ways to positively identify someone. And so they knew they had Mr. Jordan. Now the issue was, okay, where did this happen?
Right.
Car in Cumberland County, car in South Carolina. What's in between? And that's Robeson County and Scotland County. And again, that's where the cell phone records became important, because it not only was it the people that were being called, it was the cell towers that were being hit. And I'll give you an example. When Mr. Jordan was making phone calls, it would ping Charlotte, Chicago, Cleveland, and then suddenly it's Pembroke, North Carolina, Roland, North Carolina, Lumberton, North Carolina, Latta, South Carolina, Laurinburg, North Carolina.
Sure, completely different from what was on
totally changed.
Yeah.
And so as we're moving forward in this case, and we're looking at trial dates.
Yeah.
It wasn't a matter of if I was going to try them together. No, because if I tried them together, I lose Demery's statement. Mm-hmm. In terms of having to redact portions. I mean, it remains a very powerful statement against him, but it's more powerful against Daniel Green. Mm-hmm. And then I have Daniel Green's number of different statements, but I also have the night that he agreed to go to the sheriff's department to be questioned about this, and a search warrant was executed at his mother's mobile home. And in the course of that search, the SBI agents find a gun that's hidden in the bottom of a shop vacuum cleaner. There'd been another robbery just a few days or weeks before Mr. Jordan disappeared, in which two young men, a young black man, young Indian man, robbed a store on Highway 72 between Lumberton and Red Springs. The clerk at the store, elderly Indian man, reported he was shot 3 times.
Ooh.
And he positively identified Daniel Green. Daniel Green made no attempt to conceal his identity. Larry Demery was wearing a bandana on his face, and he said it was the young black man who came behind the counter with a gun. I reached my gun underneath the cash register, and he shot me, and he continued to shoot me. They took my gun. Mm-hmm. That gun was the gun that was found in the vacuum cleaner.
So you're building this, and you feel good about what you have against both of these young men. When did you come into contact with both of these guys for the first time?
The first time I was ever in court with them was at the motions to suppress.
Okay.
And so that was, I'd have to actually go back. It may have been January, maybe '94. I just don't remember the dates because we ended up doing a bunch of renovations in our courthouse, and initially we were in a very large courtroom that no longer exists. It's been divided into two, but we're hearing the motions to suppress. But as we're going through, and when I got the case, when I officially became DA, one of the things that I did that at the time was not required, but because of the media scrutiny and the fact that there was so much talk about there really wasn't a case against these guys, rather than doing just standard criminal discovery, I made a copy of everything I had and turned it over to both sets of lawyers. And as we got, because Judge Weeks had been assigned this case, he got a copy of it too. So if it ever became an issue that, the state had withheld anything, we had bait stamped it, so we had page numbers, and I could go, well, this is page 342.
Right.
The judge could go, and he said, well, I've got it.
Yeah.
As an example, but that was to protect me, and that was to try to protect the integrity of the case.
Sure, because with all that high profile, you knew it was going to be questioned in some arena somewhere.
And so they knew what I had. It became a question of how I would present it, and it became a question of how they would try to block my presentation. From a standpoint of trying, it became very easy. Just chronologically, starting with Wilmington to the time he's missing, to the time that the body is found in South Carolina, to the time that the car is discovered, and then just taking it that way. And eventually, I think they knew how it was progressing, but at that point, they really couldn't do anything. There wasn't anything to stop it. But as we're in pretrial, it eventually becomes a situation where I go to Demery's lawyers. I believe Demery had the more plausible statement of what had happened. And I was like, okay, are we really going to try this case? Your guy's confessed to felony murder. He's looking at a minimum of life in prison without parole, or he's looking at the death penalty. Are you going to plead and take your chances in sentencing with the jury, or are you really going to contest it? Because Demery had other cases. Demery was out on bond for another robbery in which he had badly assaulted a lady who was a clerk at a convenience store in Pembroke, North Carolina. They dropped a cinder block on her head while she was taking out the trash. So he was out on bond in that. He was out on bond in some other B&E cases. And they were like, well, what can you offer us? Can you take first-degree murder off the table? And I was like, no, I'm not taking first-degree murder off the table. But this is what I'll do. I am willing to let him plead to first-degree murder under the felony murder rule, which meant that the armed robbery charge merged. They had a separate conspiracy charge. That can merge. And then I'll take everything else he has, consolidate that into a separate sentence, and for a sentence of 40 years. And then it will be left up to the judge after a sentencing hearing in the murder case as to whether that 40-year sentence runs consecutively or concurrently with whatever the sentence is that the jury hands down. And initially they're like, no, we can't do that. We can't advise him to do that. And my position was, if he don't want to do that, then you understand he is a likely candidate to get death.
Sure. In
light of his history. And then the other robberies were already involved. They'd been charged. In fact, the couples from, I think they're from Rhode Island or New Hampshire, when they saw the story on national news that these boys had been arrested, they called and said, those are the boys that robbed us.
Okay, so you've got more than enough at this point in time. How long did it take Demery to agree to it?
A few weeks.
Really, that long?
Yeah, and it wasn't anything immediate that I recall. They were like, well, can't you just do this and take the death penalty off the table? I said, ethically, I can't do that. Mm-hmm. I said, but what I can do is I can stipulate in sentencing that he cooperated, that at an early stage of the process he admitted his wrongdoing, that in the event he testifies against Green, that I will stipulate to that as a non-statutory mitigating circumstance for sentencing for the jury to consider. Mm-hmm. And with that, they went and talked to him and came back and they said they'd do it. And so this is probably September, October.
95?
95. No, it's even before then because we started jury selection in Daniel Green in October of 95. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's in the spring. And we have a hearing. Judge Weeks was like, if we need to hear anything, just notify me. So we had him notified that we had a matter that needed to be heard. And so we went into court. He wasn't aware of it. Went into court. We approached the bench. As I recall, we may have met with him in chambers before, but then notified him of what we were doing. And we proceeded with the plea hearing. He accepted the plea agreement. PJC'd everything, his continued judgment, conditioned upon him testifying against Daniel Green. And so that really got the Green trial really in motion.
Right.
And so in October of 1995, we start jury selection.
Along the way, and I want to get back to that in a second, but along the way, are you in contact with Mrs. Jordan, with Michael, the family members, and bringing them in on any decision whether to do this?
What we were asked to do, the Jordan family really tried to build a wall. They didn't want the media attention. They didn't want it to become a media circus. So Michael's lawyers in Chicago became our contacts.
Okay.
So anytime anything was about to unfold, I was on the phone with one of the lawyers in Chicago who had immediate access to Michael, and it was going to Michael. Mrs. Jordan, I've never spoken to her.
Oh, really? Okay.
I've met Michael, I've met his brother Larry, and I've met his older brother James. Mm-hmm. His older brother was stationed at Fort Bragg.
Right.
In fact, it got to a point as we're preparing for Daniel Green's trial in the midst of jury selection, it became necessary to have some questions answered. And it was my belief the only person that could answer those was Michael Jordan. What was the value of the rings? When were they given? Who got them? What were the circumstances under which the car?
Right.
And the lawyer was of the opinion, Larry can answer those questions. Larry lives in Charlotte. I had to go to a DA's meeting in Charlotte. And so we arranged for a meeting between Michael's lawyer and Larry Jordan. And we met in the hotel where I was staying out near the airport. And the more I asked Larry, the more evident it became he couldn't answer the question.
Gotcha.
I mean, the answer I kept getting was, you have to talk to the man. And I'm like, and after about the third time, I finally said, who is the man you keep referring to? He said, you got to talk to Michael.
Okay.
And so with that, I look at the lawyer and I said, okay, I need to meet Michael. When can we do this? And time is of the essence.
Sure.
And so he said, well, let me go back. I'll talk to him. I'll be in touch with you. It may be that I call you on a moment's notice to go to the airport and pick up a ticket, and you may fly to Phoenix because they had already started the NBA season.
Sure.
And you may have to fly to Phoenix and interview him on the tarmac. or it may be, and I was like, okay.
Oh, wow.
So we go through jury selection, and we still haven't, neither the SBA agent in charge of the case, the Robeson County Sheriff's detective who became the lead person for them, nor I have spoken to Michael Jordan. And it's...
Did you find that odd?
No, I didn't find it odd. I mean, I understood. I don't think, in hindsight, I don't think that the lawyers, when we eventually talked with him, had fully explained to him why these three guys from Lumberton, North Carolina were coming to meet him.
Oh, really?
And so we ended up we finished jury selection December 19th or 20th, right before Christmas, after 2 months of jury selection. And I get on the phone, and I call Mr. Brandt, that was his lawyer's name, and I said, look, I got to meet him now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Christmas is coming. We start evidence in January.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, let me see what we can do. And it was the season where the Bulls started off like undefeated.
Right.
And then they go to New York to play on Christmas Day, and they lose.
Oh.
And so the plan was we flew to Chicago. SBA agent Kim Hefney, Anthony Thompson from Robeson County Sheriff's Department. We fly to Chicago from Raleigh, fly into O'Hare. They pick us up. In fact, Michael's driver picks us up. We kind of interview him as we're driving back into Chicago. He takes us to the Sears Tower where the lawyers' offices are. We meet with them, and they're really briefing us. They're like, well, what are you going to ask him?
Right.
And we just like, these are the questions we need the answers to. I mean, this is vital.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, okay. He said, we're going to go to lunch. So they end up taking us to Michael Jordan, the restaurant. You ever been there?
I've heard of it, but I've never actually been there.
So there's a line down at the end of the block to get in. We pull up front door. We walk right in. Yeah. And in this restaurant, there's a private dining room, but it's all glass. And it's where Michael, I don't know if he still goes there or not, but when he was going, that's where he could go. People could see him, but yet he was walled off.
Yeah.
So we go in there, and all these heads are turned like, who are these people? And it's like, you could just hear the buzz. Is Michael Jordan coming? Is Michael Jordan going to be? And that's where we thought we were going to meet him.
Yeah.
And then after lunch, like, oh, well, let's walk over to Nike Town. And like, why are we going? Oh, look, there's Michael's statue. And I was like, okay, cool. Y'all ever been here? I said, I've been to Chicago before, not like this. And so we end up, and the reason we went to Nike Town is because Michael's corporate office is across the street. Across the street.
Okay.
In the tower, business tower of the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
So we go over there, and like Michael's on the way. We've talked to him. They came in last night from the game. They had practice this morning. It ran long because they lost. And so all of a sudden, we're joined by some security people, Michael's personal bodyguards, and they're aware that he's coming. And we're just standing there talking. The building was closed, and next thing we know, there's Michael Jordan.
He comes walking in.
He just walks in, and so we go up. We're talking on the elevator, and we go into his office. And he really thought he was going to be briefed about where we stood on the case. He said, "I know the trial's coming up," and then it was, "No, we need to interview you. You may have to come to Lumberton and testify." Because only you know the answers to certain questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the atmosphere changed.
Really?
Because he wasn't aware of what our intentions were. And, he kind of let his guard down at that point. It was funny because it was cold. And he was giving us a hard time. And he's like, oh, no, y'all all bundled up. It's not cold up here. And I'm like, wait a minute, time out. I know where you're from.
Right.
You're from Wilmington, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Down the road from Lumberton.
Yeah.
It's cold. You can't tell me it's not cold. He said, you're right. It's cold. But we had a great interview with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he looked at the photographs we had. He identified, the photographs that we made from the video.
Right.
Where Daniel Green's got the ring and the watch on. The watch literally is on his left hand, the ring's on his left hand, so you see them both at the same time. You see the NBA All-Star ring. You see, he said, yeah, I commissioned those. This jeweler I know here did this, had so many made to give to my special friends. My dad got the first.
Any emotion shown at all from him at this point in time?
No, not that I recall. I mean, I think at some point prior to this, they had come to accept what had happened.
Sure.
Necessarily didn't like it.
Right.
But there was no emotion.
Like, go get that. I mean, I'm counting on you guys.
None of that. He just said, I understand what you've done. I understand there's a deal that's been made. He's going to testify. My lawyers explained to me after the hearings on the motions, it was going to be a race to the courthouse to see who got the first and best deal. Mm-hmm. He said, I got no problem with that.
That surprised you at all?
No. And so when we talked about him possibly coming to Lumberton, the lawyer's like, well, he can't do that. I said, well, he's a material witness. The only way it's going to be avoided is if I can get the lawyers to stipulate to what he has told us. Mm-hmm. And I won't know that till I get back to Lumberton. So I said, this is the way we can do it. I know you don't want the media attention because the media was everywhere outside the courthouse any day. It was like, who's coming today? Is Michael coming? I said, this is what we can do. We'll start. He'll be in the order of witnesses somewhere like during the middle of the day when nobody's outside watching what's going on. He'll come in, not in with, y'all may come in with him. We'll put him in an unmarked police car, drive into the basement of the courthouse. He'll come in the Sally Port, walk in the back door there, immediately get on the elevator from the basement that's private. It's where we transport prisoners or defendants up and down, and then come in the back hallway, walk in the side door, take the witness stand, and leave the same way.
Did he eventually testify?
No.
I didn't think he remembered. Did he?
No, the lawyers were so willing to stipulate as to what he said. They didn't want him there. They knew what the impact of Michael Jordan coming to that trial would be. Right. His brother Larry ended up testifying. James came for a couple of days in the trial. He told the press that he was Larry's bodyguard. Oh, wow. Nobody knew who he was, and so they ended up stipulating to not only what Michael had told us, but that Daniel Green, the jewelry you saw in the photographs, were items that he had given his dad, and that was the first evidence that the jury heard.
That takes us up to the trial, where Johnson Britt would use all of that evidence and Larry Demery's confession to convict Daniel Green of first-degree murder for killing James Jordan. Next week, in Part 2, Johnson Britt talks about the trial. He talks about the intense media scrutiny and about some of the other high-profile cases he tried in his 24-year career, including the one that had him break down and cry in court. If you know someone who you think would be a good interview for an upcoming episode, send me an email. Please let me know about it. jevans@wect.com. And if you leave me a rating or a review for this week's podcast or any others that we've done, and you send me a screenshot of it by email, well, we pick one lucky listener at random, and you could be the one getting that free WECT travel mug. I'm John Evans. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of One on One.